Okay, I am an ecologist, so forgive me. Perhaps it's not the best way, or a bit unfortunate, to have three general concepts in a title, which is just under change. So have a look. Ecological theory is just going through a reunification. Evolutionary mechanisms get a new sense by including more and more ecological insights into the originally completely population genetic picture. And in the end, the meaning of speciation is also changing because of the changing species concept. Okay. To be simple and to be pragmatic, just define species in that way that they are defined by gaps, either in phenotypes or in genotypes. If you have a pattern of diversity, then the first question will be whether this means ecological diversification or it doesn't mean ecological diversification. If speciation doesn't happen in complete spatial isolation, so if it is not allopatric, then immediately the next ecological question arises, and this is about the mechanisms of coexistence of the emerging Mendelian populations. Will they coexist, or one of them will be excluded? And then if you have a unified niche theory, then you are able to give all those ecological situations where niche segregation is possible, where coexistence is possible, where speciation is possible. If you have a unified niche theory, then the next question is how it is connected to the classic theory of theories of natural selection and to the central metaphor of the classic theory, and this is the fixed adaptive landscape. If you have a unified evolutionary theory in that sense that you have both genetics and ecology within the theory, then both the genetic principles and the ecological principles has to be explicit and should be discussed in the same framework. Okay, the outline of my talk is then that first I shall give the population genetic and ecological principles of evolutionary theory and compare them very briefly. Then I shall formalize the conditions for coexistence in terms of population regulation, all my questions directed to population regulation over this conference. And the third one, that I compare the regulated and fixed adaptive landscapes and discuss the range of use, both of them. Okay. This talk is based on several publications of Geza Messina, mainly. The first one is a general theory of competitive exclusion and limiting similarity. And then there are this application to structured and fluctuating environments, not all the papers listed here. And then a series of papers of competitive speciation under various ecological situations. And you can consider my talk in that way as well, that this is another attempt to transfer the message which was published in a Physical Review letter paper on the relationship between population dynamics and dynamics of Darwinian evolution. Okay, let's start with the principles. As we all know, evolution requires variation, inheritance, reproduction on both sides of the Atlantic, and even the rest of Europe was educated in this manner. Leontin was so kind that in a recent book review, he also formulated these four principles: principle of variation, heredity, differential reproduction, and mutation. And he also added that these encapture the mechanisms, the basic mechanisms of evolution. Okay, these are the basic genetic mechanisms of evolution, but Did Darwin had the same in mind when he wanted to explain diversification? Do these principles are ecological principles? No, they are genetical ones. And now I would like to list the ecological principles of Darwin first, because these principles can be very easily connected to basic population dynamic concepts and structures, and can updated rather easily. So beside inherited variation, there is exponential growth potential for each living population. The outcome is the struggle for existence, which is unavoidable between the individuals and between inherited types, if there are inherited types. Then the result is either exclusion between the similar variants, so this is competitive exclusion, survival of the fittest in population genetic terms, or coexistence of dissimilar, that is divergence. So this is the divergence principle of Darwin. If you look at the logical relationship between these principles, you see that exponential growth potential in a finite world leads to regulated growth or extinction in a short period, together with inherited variation, which emerges regularly. You may have two different outcomes. If the emerging inherited variants are regulated by the same single regulating variable, then competitive exclusion will occur. It means that they share the same food, share the same place, have common enemies. These were Darwin's words in his book. So they are similar in those factors which check their growth. That was the term. Then competitive exclusion will come, and a sort of optimization goes on, and sort of directional selection goes on. If not, then more than one regulating variable regulates the emerging variants, then there is an opportunity for coexistence. Okay, let's compare these two sets of principles of evolution. Of course, there are overlaps, but there are significant differences. Population genetic theory implicitly assumes population regulation, but doesn't bother much about it. While population regulation is a central, essential concept in the mechanisms of diversification in case of Darwin. So that's a basic difference between population genetic theory and ecological theory. Let's turn to the mechanisms of coexistence in population regulation terms. As all know here, you require a feedback loop between population density and population growth rate in order to have regulated populations. If you make explicit the regulating variable in this setup, then this loop has two main components: impact and sensitivity. How the population density influences the regulating variable, and how sensitive is population growth to the regulating variable. So these are the two components of the fitness loop, which is very important. Then the conditions for coexistence are rather simple and can be given in an extremely general way, not only for linear models, not only for discrete regulating variables, and so on. So this can be done mathematically. Then the different, either the competing variants are regulated of a different set of regulating variables, so they don't compete but they just coexist together. Or if they share regulating variables, then a large difference both in the impact and both in the sensitivities is required for coexistence. So both parts of the fitness loop should differ in order to coexist. What are the regulating variables? Regulating variables is not just resources as you usually use it here, but of course, so concentration of nutrients, density of empty sites, but herbivores, predators, parasites, pollinators, so the density of these things are the regulating variables. What about regulated and fixed landscapes? The classic view, what we learned from MacArthur and his school, that, and Hutchinson, is that you may have these basic three types of niche segregation, and these basic segregation types can be maintained today as well. So there can be functional segregation, there can be spatial segregation, and there can be niche segregation in time. A very good example for functional segregation is the case of the Darwin finches. I love this paper very much. And this is the bimodal distribution of Geospiza fortis. And you see that here, this big size distribution is just in the center of the problem. Because what does big size distribution determine? Big size distribution determine seed size distribution. So big size is a regulation-related trait, and determines distribution of seed size, and the distribution of seed size affects how the population growth rate, okay. So the regulating variable is the seed mass. It was, the grants provided plenty of evidence, very profound evidence, that these ground finch populations are regulated by the biomass of the available seeds. Okay, just for illustration, most of you more familiar with these things that I am who don't work in adaptive dynamics. But this is a Lotka-Volterra type competition. So it is very simple. It is just for illustration, but it contains the essence of the problem, and therefore it is very useful. So you have the fitness, and the fitness of a rare strategy depends on the distribution of strategies, that is, on the distribution of seed size. You can construct your fitness function in that way that it has a frequency-independent maximum, and the place of the maximal growth rate determined by this expression. And here is the frequency-dependent type, and this part is the competition function. This characterizes how strong the competition is, and this is the old Darwinian rule that the more similar the two big size is, the smaller the fitness is, the more intensive the competition between the two of them. And if you simulate this according to this equation, then on the small graphs, you can see two things. One is the fitness function, so on the x-axis there is the strategy, let's say big size. This is the fitness function, and in gray you see the distribution of big sizes. And you see that, of course, as it is expected by population genetics theory as well, the distribution always moves to the direction of increasing fitness. And it can arrive to a minimum, and after that it can branch. So the essence of this process is that the big size distribution of the population affects the seed size distribution. You can plot it in a three-dimensional graph, similarly to Ulf, who in his book, in the introductory chapter, made a very similar thing. So you have here the trait, here is the fitness, and here is time. Okay, here is time. So it changes in time, and that makes possible to reach branching, and the problem disappears that you have to mingle between two stable states and how you get there into the minimum. Yeah. There is an example of cross-feeding in bacteria, where in a completely homogeneous environment, just the autonomous process produces divergence, and this is again a functional segregation. Okay, in Schluter's book, which is very influential, is full of fixed adaptive landscapes, and it has very strict conditions. One strict condition is that the selective environments of the islands differ, and they don't depend on the distribution of traits. And of course, this is not true for big size. We just showed that big size is a regulation dependence thing. So when it is true when the trait investigated doesn't take part in this loop, but it is outside, and this is the intrinsic rate of increase. So the rate of increase when the population is at very low density. And ecological tolerance studied this quite often. And in classic population genetic theory, when the fitness of two alleles, the selection coefficient between their fitness is just constant, doesn't depend on population density, then this view can be applied rather easily. In this case, from an ecological point of view, a population regulation is by a single variable, and a fixed landscape corresponds here. So this is the comparison between the two setups. You always have to use regulated dynamic fitness landscape when there is a trait which is a regulation associated. And when it is just belong to the intrinsic rate of increase, then it's, you can use the fixed one. Okay, no, I have no time for the summary, or?
30 seconds is fine.
So this is the summary. These are my main messages. That Darwin described the ecological mechanisms of evolution very, very aptly, so extremely nicely. Population regulation has to be quite different for robust coexistence. Speciation requires diversification of population regulation. And in case of sympatric and parapatric speciation, so when there is this dispersal in the situation, then you have to use the regulated landscape. In case of allopatric speciation, it may be enough to use the fixed one. And these are the acknowledgements to our collaborators and James Mallet for recent discussions. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. The first question is here. Can we get the microphone, please?
Thank you very much for your talk. What I'd like to point out, maybe a comment or a question, I don't know, is that I think that in one sense Darwin has been corrupted by later people that try to develop a general theory in speciation in the modern synthesis, because they didn't pay much attention to the ecological selection. Do you agree? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's follow. Then, I think that maybe you missed, I don't know, a point in all these fantastic schemes of ecological and genetic theory for speciation. And now we know that there is a lot of hybridization between species.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yeah.
Okay, well. If there is a lot of hybridization, the question is, why species maintain their integrity? If there is a lot of hybridization, you should find a kind of either displacement or a fusion of the species.
Yeah.
And this is solved because people say, in the modern synthesis, that the hybrids are lower in fitness, which we know that this is not true in many cases.
Yeah, it changes.
Because I can use ecological and I can use the ecotones.
Yeah.
Okay? So now, this is a kind of paradigm, kind of dilemma, actually. because with your schemes, you don't solve this problem. And this was solved by people like Templeton, for instance, that talked about the cohesiveness in the species. The definition of a species as a cohesive, I don't know if I pronounce it well, cohesive world, a cohesive genome. And we know this works in many cases because even if you introverse genes from one species into another, it doesn't matter. Because the species has the real core of genes that maintain the species adapted to its niche. So this concept of cohesiveness, I believe that it should be incorporated in your schemes.
I had 15 minutes, okay, and I see the problem because these are the two words, and it is rather difficult to communicate about this. But I think that, for instance, in case of Darwin finches, there is hybridization, and there is extremely large ecological diversification. And this ecological diversification can maintain the separate forms, and these forms may change in space, your paper in this year, and may change in time, but always regenerated. And perhaps hybridization just has a role that it can be regenerated each time. And so I think that the genetics, in many cases, is extremely simple. If you look through the new results, then surprisingly simple changes lead to changes in forms, which can be maintained together and can be called species. And of course, there are many cases which is much more complicated, but I just wanted to be very simple and emphasize the simple things.
I was glad to see the notion of the dynamic landscape in the talk. And I wondered, perhaps, except for Dan Bogart's talk, why people seem to be avoiding the density dependence causes in the dynamic landscape. We have, starting with Ernst Mayr in 1922, his PhD dissertation, a long history of ecologists showing that population density itself can change the shape of the dynamic landscape and lead to speciation.
Okay, I can answer that, but I don't know whether. Okay, so it is done in that way that if population density, the total density of the population, regulates the population, then this is a single factor regulation and no coexistence is possible. Okay? And if you have frequency dependence, it means that fitness depends on the frequency distribution of these traits, then you may have coexistence and you have multiple factors or one factor, one variable divided by quality as a regulating factor. So it is not ignored at all. In order to have coexistence, you need frequency dependence in that sense as it was built into the model.
The dynamic landscape that you showed us included dynamism as caused by different densities, different strategies of phenotypes.
Yes. The distribution gives,
the distribution.
Yes. Instead of the total density, when you don't have coexistence, you use the distribution.
Just to elaborate on that point a little bit, I think one of the advantages of the framework that we have presented is that it allows you to identify, actually compels you to identify the environmental regulating variables. And if you do that in a particular model, you find that you only have one, such as density. There's pause for further thinking, because then you are working in a specific class of models, maybe we would even call them structurally unstable, because as soon as you introduce even a little influence from a second environmental variable, you can get different results. Coexistence suddenly becomes possible. So it's a kind of antidote to sticking too much to oversimplified models. That you think about how many environmental variables do I have, and come up with
I will be happy to talk about this.